It is being widely reported that Andy Lee's first defence of his middleweight title will be against Patrick Nielsen, not Billy Joe Saunders. I'm going to talk in depth about the Billy Joe Saunders fight, why I believe this isn't a bad thing for Billy Joe Saunders, in a few minutes. But first, I'm going to spend my time talking about the actual fight itself, Andy Lee versus Patrick Nielsen. The way I'm viewing this is as a homecoming fight for Andy Lee. Another payday for Andy Lee. A chance for him to get a nice fight in front of the Irish public against a beatable opponent, hopefully sell a lot of tickets, generate a lot of interest, and to make a few quid out of it. Patrick Nielsen is not a guy who I would consider as a top 20 middleweight. I am aware of him. I have seen his fight against Dmitry Chudinov, which is actually quite an interesting fight to watch when we consider that Nielsen, who lost that fight, is now fighting for a recognised version of the world title, whereas Chudinov, who was successful that day, is fighting against Chris Eubank Jr. So it's an interesting fight because it's one of Chudinov's better wins, useful form in terms of predicting the Chudinov-Eubank Jr. fight, and it also is Nielsen's only loss, so it perhaps gives an insight as to his weaknesses and in what kind of way Andy Lee may be successful about him. Now, my view on Nielsen is that, he's solid. He's not terrible by any stretch of the imagination. His record is 23-1. He's only lost once. He's never been stopped. But in terms of who he's actually beaten, in my opinion, there isn't anyone of great note, and that Chudinov was probably the best opponent who he's been in with, and he promptly lost. The way I view Nielsen stylistically is he's not the biggest puncher in the world. I mean, let me look at his record. Of his 23 wins, 11 have come by way of knockout. And if you watch him fight, he doesn't look like a puncher. He looks quite wild. He's got a tendency to be quite inaccurate. Dmitry Chudinov is not the most refined boxer in the world, I think it's fair to say. But even in the early rounds of that fight, you can see Chudinov's head movement sometimes is enough to avoid Nielsen's jab and head punches. You can actually see Chudinov almost counter-punching on Nielsen and sort of anticipating his shots, which possibly isn't a good sign when you're looking at fighting for a world title. I think Nielsen, he's got a decent enough set of legs on him. The guy can move respectably. He's not got the slowest hands I've ever seen. He throws combination punches. But my worry is his punches probably don't have enough sting in them to hurt or to push back a fighter like Andy Lee. I think it's very unlikely that Nielsen, who doesn't knock out the majority of his opponents, is going to step up to world title level and knock out the champion. So I think Nielsen's only chance of winning is by points. And I think with his inaccuracy and his tendency to get hit, which I'll come on to in a second, he could be in for a tough night. Let's make no mistake about it. Whilst Nielsen is not a finished article, neither is Andy Lee. In both of Andy Lee's last two fights, Matt Korobov and John Jackson, he was getting soundly outboxed throughout the first few rounds of the fight. In both of those fights, he was trailing on the judges' scorecards. Effectively, I do think it is possible for a technical boxer with good sort of amateur pedigree, good attributes to outbox Andy Lee. What Andy Lee carries is dangerous power, and on both of those occasions, despite the fact that he was getting outboxed, he was able to win by stoppage. Now, with that in mind, I think Nielsen's potential defensive frailties are something to be very, very mindful of ahead of this fight. As I've already mentioned, I don't view Chudinov. I think Chudinov's solid. I think he's respectable. I think he may well beat Chris Eubank Jr. But he's not elite technically. He's not got the fastest hands. But what he did was really sort of outscore Nielsen. He was able to land on him. He was able to hurt him. There were times that he beat him on both the inside and the outside. You can see Nielsen getting hit with hooks on the inside. At times you could even see Nielsen eating a jab. And I think with those defensive frailties, it's likely that sooner rather than later, Andy Lee's going to be able to land on him. I don't see this as an overly competitive fight. Nielsen has never beaten anyone at Andy Lee's level. Nielsen doesn't carry a lot of power. Nielsen is defensively open against a knockout artist. For me, this isn't a dangerous fight for Andy Lee. It's very unlikely Andy Lee gets stopped by Nielsen. Nielsen's only chance to win this fight, in my opinion, is on points. And for me, he doesn't have the technical pedigree. He doesn't have the refined skills to outpoint Andy Lee over a 12-round fight. So I think this is very much sort of first defence, nice defence, homecoming, payday for Andy Lee. And I think this sets him up to fight Billy Joe Saunders in the summer. Now, as regular viewers to my channel will know, I'm a big fan of Billy Joe Saunders. Not necessarily as a personality, but as a boxer. I was very strong in my assertion that Billy Joe would get the job done against Chris Eubank Jr. And I think Billy Joe's got the potential to be a world champion in the middleweight division. Billy Joe is not a finished article. Stamina problems, which we've seen before in his career, came out again in the Chris Eubank Jr. fight. Now, I know Billy Joe trained exceptionally hard for that fight, but over the course of his career he hasn't had the best lifestyle for a pro sportsman. And what I believe is that even though you can get yourself fit and you can get a six-pack over the course of a training camp, years of blowing up in weight, years of eating badly, years of drinking, etc., cannot be eradicated with an 8-week training camp. It needs to be a long-term lifestyle change. And I think Billy Joe needs more training camps like that, more time in the gym, more time dedicated to the sport and with a new lifestyle before taking the real big fights at middleweight. So I think him having another fight in between, potentially against a rugged opponent who will take him 12 rounds, no one is going to beat him, no one is going to, cause him too many problems, but a guy who's tricky, a guy who is going to stay around for a few rounds would be very, very useful. I think whilst I am a huge fan of Billy Joe Saunders, there's still more to come from him, and he hasn't arrived at his absolute peak just yet. Secondly, what I'd say is, I think Andy Lee versus Billy Joe Saunders has the potential to be a massive, massive fight. And I think seeing it in the summer potentially means it could be a stadium fight, an outdoor fight. So I think if Andy Lee can take care of business with Patrick Nielsen, and I don't know when that fight is rumoured to take place, so I imagine March, April time, and Billy Joe can have a keep busy fight in between, perhaps even on the February the 28th bill that Frank Warren is hosting. then it sets it up really nicely for a big fight in the summer, where both can make big money, and also Box Nation can do really well out of it. It will drive subscriptions. Both of these guys, their sort of exposure and their profile is at an all-time high right now. You've got Andy Lee, who's just won a title, Billy Joe, who's just been involved in one of a massive domestic fight. Obviously, when that fight gets made, when there's a date announced, I'll do more videos on it. But my initial reading is that Billy Joe beats Andy Lee. I think Billy Joe has superb amateur boxing credentials. I think he's got excellent jab, excellent movement, excellent speed, excellent combinations. And I expect Billy Joe to outbox Andy Lee in the early rounds, just like he did to Chris Eubank Jr., just like Matt Korobov and John Jackson did to Andy Lee. The difference is, I also believe Billy Joe is really tough. I think he showed an excellent chin against the likes of Chris Eubank Jr. And I think despite the fact that he was visibly tired, he showed the engine to keep going and to get the job done on that occasion. I don't think Andy Lee is going to be able to get rid of Billy Joe in the same way he was against Matt Korobov, the same way he was against John Jackson. And I believe Billy Joe has the skills and the experiences to outbox Andy Lee and to win on points. Credit to Frank Warren, Billy Joe really has been built up in the right way. He's not a Chris Eubank Jr., he's not a Matt Korobov, who's going to get found out first time he steps up. Because the guy's been stepping up repeatedly. He's fought tough 12-rounders with top domestic competition like John Ryder, Blackwell, Eubank Jr. He's fought international guys. Spike O'Sullivan from Ireland, who was unbeaten. Emmanuel Blandamura, who was unbeaten. For me, he's got what it takes to beat Andy Lee. But it's no negative whatsoever that he gets another fight in, another training camp under his belt, another payday, and it set up a huge fight in the summer. Let me know your thoughts. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Andy Lee Nielsen. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the Billy Joe Saunders fight. Thanks for watching.